So we can, we talked a bit about the history, how VR has kind of evolved over time. We'll now look a bit at how we can utilize it. Now, sort of the more obvious example is gaming, right? Games have always sort of, I want to say the games industry has always sort of, in some ways, driven a lot of technology, partly because of its consumer-based sort of focus. Right, everything has to run fast. It has to be affordable, and so a lot of things tend to get driven by gaming. And so it's also very visible in the media. So you have a bunch of different kinds of games. You've got VR ports of existing games. This happened a lot more um, in the early days, where you'd get a first-person shooter and somebody would do a sort of a quick and dirty port where you're kind of looking around in a headset. Um, More often now, you're getting games that are purpose-built for VR. Things that really take advantage of your motion controllers, of the body awareness, tracking your head movements and your body positions. Um, so you've got a bunch of really interesting things that are happening, right? Um, Really interesting interactions like these escape room type games where you're physically reaching for things, turning things, touching things. Um, you've got things that sort of allow you to experience things like, okay, like a military shooter where you're actually sort of pantomiming, holding a weapon, or holding, let's say these medieval games where you're holding a sword. Um, so these are really interesting because they allow you to fully get immersed, not just visually, but your body awareness of what's going on. Now, the there's some really interesting UI and UX things that kind of happen, and this you saw this a lot with again the early days when there were a lot of VR ports of existing games. Um, a lot of the UI things that you take for granted when you're looking at flat screens, um, whether it's for games or for applications, a lot of those kind of go out the window. Um, when you're looking at things like sort of tried and true UI methods, health bar, on top. Um, I don't know, let's say ammo counter, bottom corner, I don't know, maybe a mini map, top corner of the screen, where things are sort of like moved out of your visual range so you can see them in your peripheral vision. All those kind of go out the window when you're looking at VR because you can't you can't put things out of the periphery because typically a person is going to at least tilt their head a little bit to look at something. If you put it at the periphery, that periphery starts moving further and further away as you look at it. So a lot of really interesting UI studies have started being done after that initial phase of porting VR things to porting flat screen games to VR. Now, actually, let me go back a second. There was a question earlier on the Q&A asking why everyone's first thought or first like association for VR is games and entertainment. And I think a lot of that kind of comes down to just the visibility, right? Like you immediately think of games just because that's usually what you see in the media. Um, you think of like, these first person shooters, you think of these escape room games. Those are the mass market stuff. Right? These are things that are going to be visible. Um, that said, it was a good question because yes, there are a lot of applications outside of games. Um, so we have things like data visualization, right, which is actually quite interesting. I would say it started off kind of gimmicky because you're looking at, you're like, okay, hey, here's a 3D graph, and you can walk around it, and that was basically it. So, but there's a lot of really interesting uses for these kinds of visualizations, right? Molecular visualization. We'll walk around, um, a chemical, like a chemical structure, and structure of atoms, and really kind of literally like put your head in, kind of dive in and look at these things up close and see the spatial relationships. I think that one was actually the really big one, was when I tried out some of these data viz. The spatial relationships became really clear because you're kind of walking around these things. The collaborative viewing is pretty interesting just because you've got a bunch of people, whether it's in the same room or virtually, looking at these these structures, these data structures. There's also, sort of a with I guess the relatively recent trend in the last few years of moving towards, what they call beautiful data. Having data visualized in 3D and VR makes for opens up a lot of possibilities for that beautiful data. Um, the Now this one kind of goes towards that question, where there are a bunch of use cases in or AEC, architecture, engineering, construction. You got manufacturing, automotive, medicine, military, and these run the gamut, all over the place, right? Like, you got vehicular simulations, whether that's a plane. So you see over here in the first screenshot, you've got a pilot, running through a check, like a pre-flight checklist, right? Because you've got all the switches physically there. You gain all this muscle memory, you gain all this spatial awareness of what's going on. You can run through a pre-flight checklist on a computer, just literally run through that checklist and say, okay, yes, I gotta flip this switch. Okay, yes, I gotta start the engine. Yes, I gotta do this and that. But actually having to sit there and reach out and flip a switch, press a button, um, introduces a huge amount of, your muscle memory, and you obviously remember better by doing than by seeing or, reading. Um, there's things like virtual surgeries, which is also another big one, whereby you're looking at being able to put on a headset and get, some custom hardware that allows you to perform, let's say, a virtual surgery, an incision, some sort of, I don't know, heart bypass. And the huge thing about this is that, obviously being virtual, this is a vastly cheaper, and a lot more, it's a lot lighter on personnel resources than actually running whether it's a physically simulated operation or having interns, kind of do their training on actual people, right? There's only so many people you can run through in a day, or a week. Whereas with a virtual surgery, you can just kind of run that, get it down pat, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. So it's cost saving. There's the immersiveness and just the learning potential. There's military police training. You got equipment training. Again, being there physically and actually seeing and flipping switches physically is a huge, game changer. One kind of interesting one is over here on the bottom left, where uh, there were construction companies that were using VR to, kind of do virtual onboarding, both in terms of safety, like, hey, get your helmet on and all this, but also in terms of just kind of getting your first virtual look at what it might be like to be on a crane, like 100 meters up in the air with, simulated drift, right, as the structure is swaying. And that kind of gives you actually a surprisingly good feel for like what it might be to look down when you're 100 feet up in the air on a swaying crane. So there's a lot of really interesting use cases there, again, outside of games. Some other interesting use cases, you've got physiotherapy, psychotherapy, diversity training. This one in the middle is pretty cool. This was several years ago, but it was a vaccination app for kids where, kids would come in. I think it was in Spain, if I remember correctly, but kids would come in, put on a headset and do their vaccinations with this little character who essentially represented the nurse, walking them through this, their vaccination, their jabs. And from basically from the case studies that they've shown, it made a huge difference in terms of just the kids' comfort level, right? They're like, okay, hey, I'm a hero in this kingdom, and I'm getting my jab now. So there's some really interesting use cases, and there's the physio and psychotherapy, where you're looking at, if you're trying to retrain your legs, right? You've lost the use of your legs. You're retraining them. There's only so much you can stand on a treadmill, or like stand and hold yourself up and just kind of walk day in and day out, when you're just looking at you're looking at like the therapy center, right? There's only so much you can do without, kind of losing it, right? So what some centers are doing is basically kind of giving you a headset, and so as you're physically walking on your treadmill, you're actually virtually walking through like this nice meadow or this forest, this beautiful fantasy place, which gives a lot more, honestly, a lot more motivation, and also kind of just a lot more visual interest, to the people who are actually going through this therapy. Um, Diversity training is another interesting one. I had a friend who ran this company that was doing VR diversity training, where one of the interesting things is that you put on a headset and you essentially embody somebody that you're not. Going through, situations, let's say in the workplace, that you ordinarily wouldn't, as let's say for myself, like a Chinese male in Singapore, right, or in Australia, like a white male person who might not experience, let's say, um, as a female employee, uh, things that are said, situations that are put in. So kind of putting yourself physically and virtually in that situation makes for actually a very compelling experience.